But Churchill says, and then later, interestingly enough, later after the war, Churchill reflected on things and said, it was absolutely necessary to tell people, he was not, I think, being cynical. I wouldn't call it cynical. He says, it is absolutely necessary to tell people that they are better than they actually are in order for them to act in ways that are better than they would have acted. Now think about that. And if it works, it's almost miraculous. So we'll turn to Du Bois in a minute, because that's another speech with several points very clearly laid out and, as it were, a battle plan marshaled. So if you have the Du Bois, please pull it out. It's in our own words. And in the meantime, I want to say a few words about something I said last week, and then something about Lincoln and how he studied. Last week I mentioned rhetoric as communal, temporal, ethical, aesthetic, and contingent. And I've asked you to do just a little reading in Farrell's book, Norms of Rhetorical Culture. And you will recognize some of those words when you do. It's not much is assigned in that book, and it's optional. But if you turn to it, I think you'll see that that's where I've drawn some of those terms for the qualities of rhetoric, that it takes place in time and it works through time, that it's communal, that it has an aspect of galvanizing people, that it can be ethical, it should be ethical, or to put it even more strongly, it ought to be ethical, ought carrying a greater weight of moral necessity. It is aesthetic because it has a shape and a wholeness to it at its best, and it's contingent because it is not grounded in absolute theories of right or wrong. It is grounded in probabilities and possibilities at the present time. It doesn't mean it ignores theories of right and wrong, but it cannot always strictly follow them. So therefore, it must deal with contingent situations. So I want to say just a couple words about Lincoln's learning. He was an autodidact himself. It's very funny about Lincoln. A lot of the images of him as a little boy reading by the fire, using charcoal and a shovel to write on or slate, are more or less true. He didn't really have a formal education. So what does he decide to educate himself in? He studies grammar. He studies logic. And he studies poetry. He does a lot of reading. Now, what would you expect of a big, strong man on the frontier of the United States at that time? What would such a man very often be expected to do by his family, neighbors, and those who employed him? Don't forget, there's a country to be built. What is the image often of Lincoln? Manual labor working, splitting rails. Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter. Turns out that's not quite right, historically, interestingly enough. People who knew Lincoln said some of the following things. What he read well and thoroughly, never forgetting what he read. He read Lindley Murray's Readers, Scott's Lessons in Elocution. Abe read all the books he could lay his hands on, and when he came across a passage that struck him, he would write it down. And he'd write it down on boards if he had no paper. And he'd keep it there till he did get paper. Then he would rewrite it, look at it, and repeat it. He had a copybook, kind of a scrapbook, in which he put down all the things that he wrote and preserved them. He read diligently. And then you can tell the attitude of some of the other people who knew Lincoln. Abe was awful lazy. He worked for me, but was always reading and thinking. I used to get mad at him. Dennis Hanks said, Lincoln was lazy, a very lazy man. He was always reading, scribbling, writing, ciphering, writing poetry and stuff. Yeah, Lincoln wrote some poetry. Not bad poetry. Certain American presidents have had a love of poetry. Lincoln could recite whole long poems by Robert Burns and did so to his cabinet. Teddy Roosevelt loved poetry. He used to review books of poetry. Roosevelt was a great ornithologist in many ways. He's also a great lover of poetry. John Kennedy knew poetry. Gave a speech we'll look at later in which he talks about Robert Frost. So here are people on the frontier suspicious of Lincoln because he's going to do a lot of writing and reading, and he's going to study grammar, and for God's sakes, poetry too. Can you think of anything more useless on the frontier? Well, it turns out it held Lincoln in extraordinarily good stead, because all of that studying, distilled and turned to a practical purpose, resulted in something like that House Divided speech. It's very hard in that speech to go through and say, I'm going to knock out every unnecessary word, every word that has no effect, or every word that is unintentionally put there by some bad habit of association. No. It's not all that long. And boy, does it say a lot. It says a lot about a number of years of history, a number of political actions, a number of political players, and a treacherous situation facing the nation as a whole on which Lincoln believes there must be action. You cannot write a few thousand words to cover all of that without really having paid attention to what language can do efficiently. Hank said I would say he was a stubborn reader. I remember one person actually said that Lincoln would study poetry and go to poetry and speaking societies so much that they were afraid for his health, that he turned pale. He wasn't eating well because he was sticking with the books. When Lincoln ran for president, someone wrote to him and said, "What's the secret, Mr. Lincoln, of being a good lawyer and a good politician? I'm going to study law. What should I do?" Lincoln wrote back a very short letter in which he essentially said, well, you get the books, and I forget what they were, Chitty and Greenleaf, but other standard law texts. He said, you get the books, and then you sit down and read. In other words, that, as much as anything else, will form your mind for the practical engagements that come up. That's exactly what Lincoln did. He was an anomaly. He was odd, was strange. Yes, apparently so. That is to say, he would put things in his hat as some. It's not an idiosyncratic habit of his alone. That if you had an important paper or something, you might stick it in the lining of your top hat. Men often wore top hats then, not a cap, but a regular top hat, and you stick it in the lining there. It's just a habit, If you had clothes without pockets, you might do that, or if you wanted to make sure it's where you kept it. I think that's portrayed in the movie Lincoln as well. I'm not sure. Does anyone remember that? At any rate, Lincoln was a quirky fellow in many ways. He also, I hate to say it, although it's part of his character, we shouldn't gloss it over. Some of the stories he told people in private were off-color stories. They would not be approved of today at all. But in part, he told these stories to get a kind of camaraderie among, these were males, of course, who were listening to him. But this ability to give a narrative when he turned to open political situations was highly successful. So let's take a look at this speech by Du Bois. Du Bois is leading a movement called the Niagara Movement, and there are other individuals who are leaders at this time among African Americans, and one of them is Booker T. Washington. And Du Bois and Booker T. Washington have different attitudes about how to carry out this struggle. And Booker T. Washington tends to favor more patience, more forbearance, and a less confrontational attitude. But Du Bois doesn't. And Du Bois, in giving this speech, is helping set many of the themes for the later civil rights movement. He says, the men of the Niagara movement, coming from the toil of the year's hard work and pausing a moment from the earning of their daily bread, turn toward the nation and ask again, in the name of 10 million, the privilege of a hearing. And I'd suggest that's essentially, for the part we have, that's a kind of introduction. And what does it say about the men of the Niagara movement? Yeah, they work hard. That's an important thing. We are not a bunch of vagrants who are out here demanding something. We work hard for a living. and we are meeting in order to get a hearing for something. What has happened? The narrative begins almost immediately. What has happened to these men, to their families? No? Yes, discrimination, and he even, no, go ahead, no, hold it. He uses a stronger word. What is it? It isn't just discrimination.
Discrimination in public accommodation.
Yeah, but if we look at that, he says, the work of what? The black man's ballot has progressed. Stealing, yes, stealing. It's discrimination, he uses that word, but it's stealing things. It's taking things. And in other words, there is an injustice here that goes beyond discrimination, bad as that is. It's actually taking away the power to change things at all by taking the votes away. Against this, the Niagara movement eternally protests. And that word protest echoes then in the speech several times. Is it okay to have a word echo in a speech? Sure, especially if it's an oral speech. How about in writing? Is that okay too? Yes, if you do it consciously and for effect. Can you overdo it? Yes, you can overdo it. Who has to tell the difference between doing it enough and overdoing it? You do. Yeah, you do. How do you tell that? Can you tell it exactly as you're writing it? No, you can't possibly. You have to go back once you've written it, and you have to reread it, preferably out loud, and discover whether that repetition is effective or not. Should you insert it one more time? Or should you cross it out? Or should you insert it in another place rather than in the place you'd initially put it? We'll talk a little bit more about these processes of revision when we talk more about composition and some tricks in how to revise. Tricks mean you can't revise everything all at once when you go back over a composition, so one of the things you can revise is word choice. Just go through your composition for one thing. Am I choosing the right words? Am I repeating them the right way? You can go through something you've written pretty quickly just making that decision, right? All right, then you go through it another time for your sentence structure and another time for the organization and so forth. If you try to revise everything all at once in a composition of any length, what happens? I don't know what happens to you, but what happens to me is the circuits start to short out and I get overloaded. And I say, oh, now I got to think about this and I think about that. No, do layered revisions. All right, now I've taken care of this. Now, sure, you may have to go back and make a few adjustments after you've done all those layered revisions. But it's an important way to approach revision, rather than feeling now I have to begin at the beginning and revise it on every aspect from the beginning to the end, because that places a very significant burden on you to keep a lot of things up in the air at once. So, he says we protest farther down. He says we protest against all such discrimination. And he uses division. He says, in detail, our demands are clear and unequivocal. First, we would vote. Second, we want discrimination in public accommodation to cease. Point that Noor brought. Third, we claim the right of free men to walk, talk, and be with them that wish to be with us. This would be simply the right of free association. In other words, you cannot keep us from gathering together as we wish. Fourth, we want the laws enforced against rich as well as poor, against capital as well as labor. The right of equality under the law, the right of equal protection. This is why the figure of Astrea, or the goddess Justice, is often portrayed as being blindfolded, holding the scales of justice. Not being partial. And if you go up to Langdale law, there's a little inscription over Langdale law, which basically says, we desire a government of laws, not of men. Meaning following the law, not the dictates of any given individual. The phrase that we often use today in both national and international contexts is rule of law. The rules are the same for everybody. So enforce them equally. That is equal protection. Fifth, we want our children educated. The school system in the country districts of the South is a disgrace, and in few towns and cities are the Negro schools what they ought to be. Do we still have a problem with school inequality in this country? Indeed we do. The problem may not be as severe as it once was, but it certainly still exists. To some degree because local schools are funded how, generally? Property taxes. You think property taxes in some communities have a bigger kitty than in other communities? Of course they do. Now the states can often try to even this out, some. But even if the states try to even it out some, can parents in schools contribute money to the school for various things like football uniforms or band instruments? Yes, and do they? Yes, of course they do. And should they be able to? Sure, they should be able to. But the fact is that some parents are more able to do it than other parents. Equality of education in the public schools in this country has certainly not been achieved. Are there still racial lines upon which it falls in many cases? Indeed, there are. Take a look at James Ryan's book, 5 Miles Away, A World Apart. He was Dean of the Graduate School of Education here, and now he's left to be President of the University of Virginia. And his whole point is that the very inequality that W.E.B. Du Bois is talking here about education persists. He wrote this tale of 2 schools in Richmond, Virginia, and what has happened to them in the last 30, 40 years. It's a very interesting study. Education is the development of power and ideal. We will fight. Now, he mentions John Brown. Did John Brown fight? Yeah. Did he fight with violence? Yes. What does Du Bois say about violence?
He says he denounces violence, but he still admires the spirit of John Brown's resistance.
It's a very interesting statement indeed. He denounces violence, but he admires that particular spirit. It's quite a remarkable statement. Is that having his cake and eating it too? Maybe, and maybe that's okay. But he's explicitly saying no violence. Just as Martin Luther King Jr. will, just as Mahatma Gandhi will. And to some degree, John L. Lewis, who was head of the United Mine Workers. That was a somewhat different case. But nevertheless, when you are calling for real protest, when you've got to change the status quo, are people just going to say, yes, of course, please come and change it? No. Why not? The status quo is a development of entrenched interests, some of which are just and proper, and some of which may not be, and some of which you may convinced are not. And how to change it has to involve some sort of protest, some sort of dissent, some sort of raising a question, some sort of offering an alternative, and you very well may get stiff opposition when that occurs. And so Du Bois is saying, we will fight. We will not do so violently. And he invokes a passage in the Bible, a very interesting one. I don't know if anyone looked it up. When you come across these allusions, they're worth looking up. So he says, this is an interesting statement. I don't know if any of you looked it up. We are fighting the stars in their courses. What did you make of that? Our enemies, triumphant for the present, are fighting the stars in their courses. That's quite an image.
I sort of got that the stars being in their courses are fate, and that the people who are fighting against rights for African Americans are just like prolonging the inevitable.
Yes, yes, and they might as well fight the stars in the courses. How does this speech end? With what?
Above are the everlasting.
Yeah, above are the everlasting stars. There is a sense of cosmic justice here. The allusion is not just to astronomy, it's also biblical, and it's to the book of Judges. Du Bois, like Lincoln, studied and read a lot. Du Bois studied in college, he studied in Europe, he studied here at Harvard with George Santayana in the philosophy department here. He had a tutorial with Santayana, and they read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason together in German. There's a test for you. In other words, we're talking about serious intellectual dedication, then turned to practical and clear purposes. So one of the passages he is referring to is a passage in which the people of Israel are fighting, and they're fighting for themselves. They fought from heaven. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. Sisera is the enemy of the people of Israel there. And if you want to know what happened to the enemy in this case, and many of Du Bois' readers would have known this, though he doesn't quote it, he is in essence killed by a woman. She put her hand to the nail and her right hand to the workman's hammer, and with the hammer she smote Sisera and smote off his head, when she had pierced and stricken through his temples. At her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay down. At her feet he bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell down dead. That is behind what Du Bois is saying. Not quoted, not mentioned, even that it is from Judges, but that is his sense, ultimately, that that kind of opposition is fated to lose. Yet he's not advocating violence himself, and he explicitly opposes it. This idea of a battle or a fight is a predominant metaphor in Du Bois's speech. And you can say, well, it's in Lincoln's, it's in many others, it must be a pretty weak metaphor. No, I don't think it is. It depends how you handle it. If you want to change the status quo, you will almost certainly have to fight to do it. If you want to alter anything, you're going to have to fight and engage. And you're going to have to face the fact that you will lose some of the time. You will lose. You know, the recount in the 3rd Congressional District must have been a real heartbreaker for Dan Coe. He lost by, 145 votes in the primary for the Congressional District. That's a tough loss. If his opponent had lost by 145 votes, it would have been her tough loss. I mean, they're from the same party. Don't say your vote doesn't count. It counts. There are going to be lots of elections that might be decided by such a close margin. So there will be losses. That's part of the temporality of rhetoric. Lincoln lost elections. Votes are going to be lost. One must persist. Thurgood Marshall. I love this. This is a marvelous case, a very interesting case. Marshall, if you have it, it's in our own words. It's about page 198. Marshall later became a member of the Supreme Court. But here he's arguing before the court. And he's arguing this case about Brown v. Board of Education. And the opposition has said, who should decide this? Who should decide what happens with the schools? What should be the body or the group of people who really are the deciders in this case? Marshall's opposition claims that it's not the Supreme Court. Who is it? The legislators. Right. Each state should have its legislature decide, because otherwise, in effect, it would be the court making law. And Marshall has to face this argument. Remember what Lincoln said? You know, you'd have the slave state judges making the decision on whether it was proper or not. Well, that answer would be pretty obvious. Say in Arkansas, it probably would be likely that if you turned it over to the state legislature in the mid-1950s, what would they say? Would they say separate but equal was okay? Yeah, probably would. Separate but equal in part stems from what decision in the United States history? A very important one in the late 19th century. You should all know this. Yeah, Plessy v. Ferguson. And Plessy v. Ferguson is a case that Marshall mentions here in arguing this. But what is his argument? His argument is pretty simple, but it's not one that is necessarily obvious. He's making an argument about why it is the court, the Supreme Court, that should be making the decision in this matter.
That it's the right of the courts to protect the minorities, otherwise the majority would be able to trample on their rights?
Yes, that it is a matter of individual rights, and in this case, the rights of a minority. And unless a court is able to determine rights that are already guaranteed, then who's to do it? It shouldn't be in the hands of a legislature. And these rights in this particular case have to do with what? Do they have to do with how much money you make or don't make? Do they have to do with whether you live in a 3-story house or a 2-story house? Or what is this all about? And what has the other side tended to, who had their hand up? What has the other side tended to obfuscate?
This is about the equal rights for education, and the other side obfuscated the distinction that if you separate two groups of people, one of them is going to feel less, is going to feel marginalized,
right?
Feel left out.
And what's the distinction in these two groups of people?
The color of their skin.
Race, yes, this is a racial distinction. And he's saying that's the matter in this case. And how does he know it's the matter in this case? I love this. This is, may it please the court. So far as the appellants are concerned in this case, at this point, it seems to me the significant factor running through all these arguments up to this point is that for some reason, which is still unexplained, Negroes are taken out of the mainstream of American life in these states. There is nothing involved in this case other than race and color. In other words, this really isn't about the right of a legislature to make decisions on local schools. What this really is about race and color. I do not, and then this brilliant stroke, I think it's a brilliant stroke, I do not need to go to the background of the statutes or anything else. In other words, I'm not going to go through the prehistory of all of this legislation. I just read the statutes. I just read them. Now, of course, he didn't just read them. He probably had studied them for ages. But it's a very effective thing. And could have he just read them? Yes, he could have just read them too. So he says, I just read the statutes. And they say, quote, white and colored, end quote. That is what it's about. And then he goes on and says, do we have any Southern legislators who are Negroes? Guess what? No, not a single one. That's interesting. Now, that doesn't necessarily make a legal argument, but it certainly adds to the argument about race. He says, I do not know whether they consider the Negroes' side or not. It is just a fact. There are no Negroes who are state legislators. But I assume that there are people who will say that separate but equal was and is necessary. And my answer to that is, even if the concession is made that it was necessary in 1895, it is not necessary now because people have grown up and understand each other. And now that's an interesting statement, because then he's saying if you oppose that, then you're saying they haven't grown up and they don't understand each other. He is putting every party on an equal footing of understanding. He's being equitable about it. He said that may have been necessary one time, but the reason for that was that they weren't mature and they didn't understand each other. Now, he doesn't say who was immature, but he says it's different now. How many years later is it? About 60 years later. You may think 60 years is a long time. When you are my age, you will not think so. It is just a fact of human life. You will discover, if you have not already, that as you get older, you will think that causes that might have been settled in 5 or 10 years are still unsettled after 30 years. They may have improved, they are not finally put to bed. So then Marshall then says, I think, sir, that the ultimate authority for the asserted right by an individual in a minority group, or indeed, he could say in any group, set aside to interpret our Constitution, which is the court. The rights of minorities, as has been our whole form of government, have been protected by our Constitution, and the ultimate authority, here he repeats the phrase, for determining that is the court. I think that is the real difference. As to whether or not I, as an individual, am being deprived of my right is not legislative, but judicial. And so, interestingly enough, this argument, now when you're in a courtroom, what kind of rhetoric are you using? Generally speaking, forensic, right. And here he's using forensic rhetoric to say that this case is a forensic case. It isn't a deliberative case for the legislature. It's a forensic case, and so its proper home is in the court. So don't turn it away, court, and send it back to a legislature and say that it's up to the legislature, because it is really yours. It's a forensic argument that this is a forensic case, not a deliberative case. And it succeeded.